Hey everyone, it's about 3:30 a.m. in the morning, so in case you're wondering why my lighting is horrible, it's because this video was brought to you by insomnia. So I decided to combine the fight scene video parts 2 and 3 because I didn't really feel like I had enough content to justify doing 2 separate videos. I'm going to cover some of my top tips with swords and knives, crossbows, and bows and arrows, and guns. I only have a couple little tips for you as far as these go, but yeah. First thing I'm going to talk about is knives. Main thing I want to focus on is the grip here. So you want to kind of make sure that when you're gripping it, you have all of your fingers touching it, and you want the thumb to be over, just so that way you have a stable grip. You don't want to have the thumb along the line like this. It's not as stable, and you definitely don't want the thumb hanging out. You don't want any of the other fingers hanging out either. You want a nice firm grip on the sword or knife. If you have your character using it, try to make sure they have a nice firm grip on it. Otherwise it could cause problems. If you have certain types of other knives, the ones like that flip, then the grip is going to be different from what I just described here. But I'll post a link to an article that talks a little bit more about the different kinds of grips for each weapon that you would use as far as swords and knives go. Next thing I want to focus on is slashing versus thrusts. So if you notice, when I do a thrust that's just straightforward like this, it's harder to predict because my wrist isn't moving. However, and same thing with footwork. The footwork is also a little bit harder to predict if you're just doing a straightforward thrust. However, if you're doing kind of like a slash, there's a little bit more warning because you have to turn your elbow and you have to turn your wrist, so that person can pick up on that and they're more likely to be able to block your attack. So the best way is to go for just the straightforward thrust if you're trying to get the jump on someone in a fight when you're writing. Next thing I'm going to talk about is footwork. If your character happens to do fencing as a hobby, some main things to know. They have to wear what's called a gorget, which is like this little steel thing that goes around your neck. So aside from having like the face mask, they usually have a gorget, and they have, if you are a mammary gland having person, you will have to wear cups for your breasts, and you have to have a cup for your crotch, because otherwise you'll end up with a rapier hitting those, and it will really hurt, especially if you're doing saber fencing, which is what I did. With the foil fencing, maybe not as much, but it's still not a pleasant experience. And as far as footwork goes, it kind of looks like an L shape, like this, with the front leg being just straightforward like this, and the back leg being turned to the side. And if you're moving, the reason why you do this L shape is, notice if you move this leg, you're not going to trip because the other leg is out of the way. So that's the reason why they do like this instead of having them like that in their stance. So that's the basic stance for fencing. And of course, the main things you want to know for fencing are, if you're doing fencing, main things that people would try to aim for typically: chest, face. And additionally, if you're doing fencing, depending on what type of fencing you're doing, again, I did saber fencing, so it's a little bit different from, say, foil fencing. You might be using other things to block, like knives. So they would usually, if you're doing fencing, you might use a knife and go outward to move the sword away. So like if the sword's coming for you, like a straightforward thrust, and you block, you're moving the sword out of the way. Next thing I'm going to talk about is darts. This is just a quick thing, and I haven't personally experienced it because I don't use darts, but this is something I've been told. If I'm wrong about it, I will post something later and let you know. But essentially, if you're using like a blow dart, you need to breathe out away from the blow dart. So, for the blow dart. And then for crossbows and bows next. For bows and arrows, main thing to keep in mind is it is a longer range weapon. It's not as easy to use up close. It takes a little bit more time, and it's harder to get it to be very accurate. So if your character uses a bow, it might be a good idea to have that character also carry a knife or something that's a little bit closer range with them, because otherwise they're going to have to resort to hand-to-hand combat when someone gets close, because the bow's not going to be super helpful. Same thing goes for crossbows as well. But for crossbows, the main thing you want to remember is, and this is from my sole experience with crossbows, and this also depends on the type of crossbow, it does take quite a lot of effort to kind of pull back the string that you need for the crossbow. However, the nice thing about the crossbows is that they're a little bit more stable, a little bit easier to aim than, say, a bow and arrow. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is if your character is using a gun in the story. Main things to remember: if your character is using a gun, you want to make sure that they're staying away from the person they're trying to use the gun on, otherwise they can get disarmed. Like, let's say their wrist gets twisted, or they push the arm up to kind of move the gun out of the way. If you want to avoid this happening, just have them use it long range. However, if you want to have the villain intimidate the protagonist by, let's say, putting the gun to the back of their head, one thing you can have them do is make sure that the protagonist is on the ground, because otherwise they're going to be able to get away, because as I mentioned in my previous video, you would be able to kind of push up. One, you can feel where the gun is, so you'd have an opportunity to push up and get the gun out of the way, and do this at the same time while you're dropping down to the floor to just avoid getting hit. So if you have them instead make sure the person's fully on the ground, sitting or on their knees, they don't have that opportunity to do that. It makes it more difficult for them to get out of the situation. But that's all I have for you today. If you liked this video, you can go ahead and click that like button and subscribe to my channel below. Thank you. Bye.